June 22, 1941. Over 3.8 million Axis troops surge across a 1,800-mile front into the Soviet Union, the largest invasion force in history. 6 months later, German advance units stand 12 miles from the Kremlin. They've captured 3 million prisoners, destroyed entire armies, and advanced farther than Napoleon ever dreamed. And they've already lost. Blitzkrieg didn't fail because of winter or frozen tanks. It failed because Germany expected the Soviets to collapse psychologically after massive defeats, just like France had. But Russia wasn't France. And that assumption buried in every German plan turned out to be catastrophically wrong. This is how the most devastating military strategy ever devised met the one enemy it was never designed to fight. What Blitzkrieg actually was. Let's clear something up. The term Blitzkrieg was coined by Western journalists during the invasion of Poland. The Wehrmacht never published an official doctrine with that name. But the concept was real. German strategy focused on rapid movement with close coordination between tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry to achieve surprise and overrun enemy defenses quickly. The goal wasn't grinding attrition. It was operational shocks so devastating that enemy command structures collapsed before they could respond. Blitzkrieg required concentrating offensive weapons like tanks, planes, and artillery along a narrow front, driving a breach in enemy defenses, and allowing armored divisions to roam freely behind enemy lines. And, critically, it assumed something specific, that political collapse would follow military collapse. France proved it in 6 weeks during 1940. German forces conquered a nation that had more tanks than Germany on paper, but couldn't coordinate them effectively. Not because French soldiers wouldn't fight, but because the speed of German operations paralyzed French decision-making. By the time commanders figured out where the main attack was happening, panzers were already cutting their communications. France surrendered while still having millions of men under arms. That pattern, that assumption about psychological breaking points, became the template for everything that followed. The plan nobody questioned. Hitler and German high command were convinced the Red Army could be defeated in 2 or 3 months, with conquest of European Russia completed by October. Their intelligence estimated the Soviets had 170 divisions. Destroy those in a summer campaign, and Stalin's regime would crumble. Simple. Hitler himself declared, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will come tumbling down." But the plan had a fatal flaw built into its foundation. The Germans launched the invasion with an incomplete logistical plan, preparing only for a quick summer campaign that would achieve victory by fall. There was no plan for supplying 3 army groups in winter weather. This wasn't because Wehrmacht planners couldn't see the dangers. Hitler didn't want to hear warnings. He wanted a plan for victory in one swift campaign. Those who tried pointing out the risks were reprimanded. The distance problem. Here's what German planners either ignored or underestimated. Distance changes everything. Operation Barbarossa attacked along a front stretching 2,900 kilometers. From the German-Soviet border to Moscow is roughly 1,000 kilometers. Paris to the German border? 450 kilometers. That's not twice as far. In military logistics, it's exponentially harder. As the army progressed deeper into Soviet territory and farther from its own railheads, logistics became an ever greater problem. The Soviet transport infrastructure was much poorer than what Germans had encountered in France. And here's the part that shatters the myth of the mechanized Wehrmacht. Up to 750,000 horses and mules served in Operation Barbarossa. Field Marshal von Rundstedt himself admitted the German army relied on divisions that moved by foot or horse-drawn vehicles. The Wehrmacht that invaded the Soviet Union consisted mainly of slow-moving infantry divisions supplied by horse-drawn wagons and spearheaded by a few armored and mechanized divisions. This wasn't a fully modern force. It was World War I logistics trying to support World War II tactics. The opening catastrophe, the first weeks looked like vindication of German confidence. The advance exceeded all expectations. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured as German tanks steamed through Soviet defenses. The Luftwaffe destroyed most of the Soviet Air Force on the ground. German General Heinz Guderian's tanks raced 50 miles beyond the frontier on the first day and reached Minsk, 200 miles beyond it, by June 27. By October, German casualties exceeded 830,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. But Soviet casualties were far worse. Millions captured, entire armies encircled and destroyed. Yet, something wasn't happening. The Soviet Union wasn't surrendering. Despite terrible losses, the Soviets' will to fight remained strong. The Soviet Union did not crumble as expected. Here's the number that should have terrified German planners. German intelligence had estimated 170 Soviet divisions. By the end of 1941, Germans had destroyed over 360 Soviet divisions, and the Red Army was still fielding organized resistance. Where were these troops coming from? The Soviet Union had a population of 190 million, and a command structure willing to accept catastrophic losses and rebuild. Every German victory was real, but they weren't achieving the strategic goal. Soviet collapse. The logistics death spiral. German engineers struggled to convert Russian railway gauge to one their own locomotives could use. Meanwhile, lorries and horse-drawn wagons had to negotiate Russian dirt roads, which became virtually impassable after prolonged rain. The numbers tell the brutal story. Horses needed 53 tons of food each day in a normal division. During one summer month in 1941, Germans took 112 tons of oats and 768 tons of hay from Russian farms. And the animals were dying. In just 2 months, December 1941 and January 1942, the Wehrmacht lost 179,000 horses on the Eastern Front. German armored divisions had to backtrack over their route of advance to pick up containerized fuel from pre-positioned dumps. A desperate modification of standard supply systems. Every kilometer forward stretched supply lines thinner. Every village burned by retreating Soviets meant less fodder for horses. Every captured Soviet locomotive was the wrong gauge for German rolling stock. The Wehrmacht was fighting a modern war with an increasingly 19th-century supply system, and the cracks were becoming chasms. The Red Army that wouldn't break. This is where we need to kill the myth that Soviet soldiers only fought because of blocking detachments shooting deserters. The Soviet losses in 1941 were genuinely catastrophic, but the command structure never collapsed. Stalin stayed in Moscow, and here's what German commanders discovered to their shock. New Soviet T-34 tanks were almost impervious to German tank guns. General Guderian noted his Panzer IV tanks could only destroy a T-34 by hitting the engine from behind. Blitzkrieg depended on paralysis, on enemies so shocked by speed that they couldn't respond coherently. The Soviets just kept responding, badly at first, with horrible losses, but they kept fighting. Every week the war continued favored the Soviet Union. Soviet production increased. German logistics worsened. Soviet manpower reserves remained deep, while German casualties couldn't be fully replaced. December 1941. The breaking point. By late November, German forces had seized a bridgehead across the Moscow-Volga Canal, standing less than 35 kilometers from the Kremlin. Forward reconnaissance units reached Khimki, just 30 kilometers from Moscow's center, the closest German forces would ever get. But they were at the end of their strength. German soldiers were exhausted, undersupplied, and still wearing summer uniforms. When temperatures dropped to -30°C, machine guns stopped firing because the oil froze thick. On December 5 to 6, 1941, the Red Army launched a major counteroffensive. Soviet units, many recently arrived from Siberia and equipped for winter warfare, attacked German forces that had reached the limits of endurance. By December 7, Soviet troops had pushed back the German shock groups that approached Moscow by 100 to 250 kilometers. The significance wasn't just tactical. The Soviet counterattack forced Germans to retreat 175 miles from Moscow. With almost 1 million casualties in 1941, Germany would never be as strong as it had been. This was the first major German defeat since September 1939. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered. Winter's real role. Yes, winter mattered, but not the way the myth suggests. The European winter of 1941 to 42 was the coldest of the 20th century. German troops suffered over 130,000 cases of frostbite. Vehicles wouldn't start. Weapons jammed. But here's the critical point. German forces weren't properly equipped for winter, because Hitler and High Command expected victory by autumn. The debilitating effects of weather and terrain were not properly taken into account when planning the campaign. Winter didn't cause the failure. It exposed a system already failing. By December, German units were under strength, undersupplied, and exhausted. Tanks needed maintenance they couldn't get because spare parts were stuck hundreds of miles back. Soldiers needed rest they couldn't have because there were no reserves to replace them. Winter multiplied problems that already existed. Blitzkrieg was designed to avoid long wars, but vast distances, logistics, and Soviet numbers created attritional losses Germany couldn't sustain. The strategy wasn't flawed. It was just catastrophically wrong for this war. Over 10 million combatants fought in Barbarossa's opening phase, with 8 million casualties by December 5, 1941. The German army advanced farther than any force in history. And it still wasn't enough, because in Russia there was always more space, more soldiers, one more army forming behind the Urals. If this caught you, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment. What other World War II myths should we examine next? Thanks for watching.